For AP Micro FRQ. This one is a strange one. We can look at it and tell because of the downward sloping demand and the marginal revenue curve that it's obviously a monopoly. It does create an externality. Shows the more, okay. Is the externality positive or negative? Explain. We can look at this and clearly see that our marginal social cost is greater than our marginal private cost, right? We also know with those two cost curves, it must be a production externality. We tend to think of negative production externalities as having to do with pollution. We don't really know what the externality is here. But we do know that when marginal social cost is society's cost is greater than the marginal private cost of the seller, that we have a negative externality. Using the labeling from the graph above, identify the socially optimal output. Explain how you determined your answer. We know that with externalities where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, that is the socially optimal quantity. Now don't forget that because it's important to know that Q2 here is our social optimal quantity. And they do ask us for the output, so we want to make sure that we say Q2. Explain how you determined your answer. It is just knowing that where marginal social cost and social benefit come together, that is our socially optimal or socially efficient output or quantity. C, suppose that good X is produced by a profit maximizing monopoly. Using the labeling from the graph above, identify the unregulated. Now, unregulated means profit maximizing or single priced. Identify the firm's output. So we know, or we should know by this time, that marginal revenue, now the tricky thing about it is knowing that the marginal private cost is the marginal cost of the firm, right? Obviously, it helps if you know that. If this is our marginal cost and this is our marginal revenue, we know where monopolies are profit maximizing, where marginal revenue and marginal cost come together. We know they're going to produce that quantity and at that price. So the monopoly's price would be $13. Quantity would be Q1. And we would just say it's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They'll accept that, I think, as our answer. To produce the socially optimum output, indicate whether the government should tax or subsidize the firm. Now, we're so used to taxing monopolies, that tends to be the first thing we want to do, right? Is to say, we should tax them because they're obviously producing a negative externality. But notice where our social optimal quantity is. We would like this monopoly to produce more of this good. So what we need to do is to subsidize it. And then they want us to calculate the dollar value of the needed per unit tax or subsidy. So what we have to recognize is, and let's just draw it in the way we know it, right? Here's our supply curve. Remember now, your marginal cost curve is your short-run supply curve. Right? So when you subsidize a good, if there's a subsidy, we tend to get more of it. So this would be S plus the subsidy, right? It's going to shift it to the right. Now we have a flat marginal cost curve here, but our costs are going to fall, right? Our marginal cost, we're going to supply more of this good. If we did it a little bit differently, we would have our marginal cost curve look like this. I always think of marginal cost as supply, especially anytime we're talking about taxes or subsidies, because then I know which way it's going to shift. It's harder to think about my costs went down. How do I shift that? But I know that if it's a subsidy, it's going to shift my marginal cost curve to the right, right? Just like it would the supply curve. And if I have, let's just use a perfectly competitive firm here, Mr. Dart, to show what happens. I know that this makes sense now. Here's where profit max was before. Here's where profit max is now. My quantity has increased just like up here, right? That as we get a subsidy, the quantity increases. That's exactly what we're looking for. The only tricky part here is that your marginal cost curve or your supply curve is flat, but it's going to shift down, right? As this firm gets a subsidy, we're going to have our marginal cost curve shift down. We'll have a new marginal private cost or marginal cost or supply curve, if you will. And we know we're going to produce where marginal revenue and marginal cost again come together, and they would now produce at that quantity and at that price. Now, recognize that that vertical distance there, right, is the amount of subsidy that we need. So we need 7 minus 4 or $3 of a subsidy to shift that or push that marginal cost curve down so that where marginal revenue and marginal cost meet, that's the quantity or the socially optimal quantity that's now produced. So I think it's $3 there. That makes sense of a subsidy. And make sure you answer it the way they want. All right. Suppose that good X is produced in a perfectly competitive industry. Answer each of the following using the labeling on the pre-identify the equilibrium output. Explain how you determined your answer. Well, we know monopoly or perfect comps tend to produce where price equals marginal cost, right? So they're going to produce right here at that Q3, right? This is now, think of this marginal cost curve here. We're back to number 7, or this one. Think of this as your Mr. DARP. And it is getting a little tricky. We got a lot of stuff on here. But if this is our Mr. DARP and this is the demand curve, right? We know that where demand and supply come together is allocatively efficient. So we know that perfectly competitive firms produce where price equals marginal cost. Remember, your demand curve is also your DARP. If this is your Mr. or marginal revenue, your demand curve is your demand, average revenue, and price. So where price and marginal cost come together, that is allocatively efficient. And we know perfectly competitive firms produce at the allocatively efficient point. I'm going to spell it wrong, but that's okay. So the output is Q3, and I think we just want to say it's where price equals marginal cost or where they're allocatively efficient. All right, to produce a socially optimal output, indicate whether the government should tax or subsidize the firm in the industry. Now, again, we know where our social optimal quantity is at Q3 or Q2. We know the perfectly competitive firm produces at this quantity, and we know we want them to produce less of this good. So we're going to tax them, right? And then they want us to calculate the dollar value of the needed per unit tax or subsidy. So we should just understand that to get this private cost curve or this, demand curve here to shift, if this is a perfectly competitive firm, we want this to go up. We want to tax this by that $5. What that does is that's going to shift this curve up here so that our marginal private cost or marginal cost will increase and we'll go up here and we will meet right there, and that will be our new quantity. So a tax and a tax of $5. All right. And that should make sense. If that marginal cost or supply curve would shift to the left with a tax, we know that. And we would get less of this, and that's exactly what we want. We know it would shift our marginal cost to the left. We would get less of the good, and that's exactly what we want. So I think we're good. All right, my friends. Be safe. Take care. Bye.